Hello and welcome back to Bigfoot Lake. It's good to be back in the company of some good friends with a good story. If you're new here and this is your first time here at Bigfoot Lake, pull up a stump and let's sit around the campfire and listen to this amazing UFO encounter at Falcon Lake in Manitoba, Canada. Now, I want you to picture for just a moment a clear night sky. You see all of those millions of stars up there, more than you could ever even think of trying to count. Now, looking into that myriad, countless number of stars, has the question ever popped into your mind, are we alone? For most people, the answer to that question is yes. So, with that thought in our mind, are we alone? Let's dive into tonight's story, the Falcon Lake Incident. On the afternoon of May 20th, 1967, a man named Stefan Michalak stumbled onto the parking lot of the Falcon Motor Hotel. He seemed drunk or something. At least that's what the Falcon Beach Highway Patrol officer thought when he spotted the man walking down the highway earlier. Michalak was an industrial mechanic by trade and an amateur geologist on the side. He would often come out to Falcon, stay in the hotel, and prospect for quartz and silver in the woods. It was not unusual to see the man around, but something had gone wrong this time. On the parking lot, Michalak approached the hotel owner and told her he needed a doctor. His eyes were bloodshot and he was out of sorts. That day there was no doctor in town, so Michalak rested in his hotel room. He phoned his wife and told her there had been an accident, but that he was okay. He asked her if she could have their son meet him at the bus terminal in Winnipeg. He would be on the next bus out of Falcon Lake. At 10:45 p.m., the bus pulled into the station in Winnipeg, and Michalak's son drove him directly to the hospital. When Michalak was seen at the emergency room, he was nauseous and dizzy. He had severe burns on his upper abdomen. What he told his physician about the injuries was likely the strangest explanation the doctor could ever have heard. He had been burned by a blast of hot air from a UFO. His account would eventually make its way into almost every encyclopedia of UFO encounters and become the topic of an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. This is the story of the Falcon Lake Incident. Stefan Michalak had been in the woods near Falcon Lake, across the highway from the town site. Chipping away at a quartz vein, he looked up and saw two oval objects in the sky, glowing in an intense scarlet color. The objects sunk toward the ground, keeping a constant distance between them, weirdly operating like a single unit until one stopped and hovered. The other ship continued to the ground, eventually coming to land quite near where Michalak knelt. The craft, still in the air, ascended and disappeared. In dead silence, it left its twin resting on a flat section of Precambrian rock. Still kneeling with pick hammer in hand, Michalak watched through the protective goggles on his face. The scarlet red of the craft faded to a stainless steel sheen, and he noticed an open hatch on the side of the craft. A lozenge-shaped opening about 2 feet by 3 feet in size. Warm air came off the craft in gusts, each wave wafting the smell of sulfur Michalak's way. A tiny electric motor whirled. Air hissed lightly. But mostly it was quiet out there in the woods. Just a man in goggles and a parked UFO. Mihalak scanned the hull for identifying decals, perhaps of the United States Air Force. Light poured out of the upper circle of the craft, flooding the ground with purple. It was so bright that it outshone the midday sun, and when Mihalak looked away, his vision was obscured by bright spots. He stood and moved closer. Within 60 feet, he listened. There were voices? He held his breath and strained to hear. From inside the craft came two distinct voices, one with a higher pitch than the other. They sounded human enough, although too muffled to make out what they were saying. "Having trouble?" Mihalak said out loud, breaking the silence. "Come on out and we'll see what we can do about it." Falcon Lake isn't too far from the American border, and these were the Cold War days. There were all kinds of secret military things going on, supposedly. No reply from the craft. He took some steps closer. He hesitated. Then he walked right up to the small hatch and peered into the opening. There were lights everywhere, focused beams shining across the interior. A series of flashing lights switched on and off in seemingly random sequences. He stepped away, and the craft remained motionless. There were no signs of welding or seams to be seen anywhere. It was extraordinary. Mihalak reached out with his gloved hand and touched its side. It was hot. It was burning hot. He pulled his glove away and saw his glove had melted. Without warning, the entire craft tilted slightly, and Mihalak felt a scorching pain across his chest. His shirt burst into flames. Instinctively, Mihalak turned away and tore off his shirt and his undershirt. He felt a rush of air around him, and he looked back at the craft. It was already rising above the treetops. And then it was nowhere. Gone. Just like its sister ship. Mihalak felt nauseous. His head began to ache. Then it ached more. He broke into a sweat and vomited on the rocks. He covered himself with his light jacket and started through the bush towards town. Something was wrong with him. The dots in his vision returned, pink dots, and printed over everything he saw. He vomited again and fought to remain conscious as the headache pounded in his skull. He felt burning on his chest. Red marks appeared. His jacket irritated the sores on his abdomen as he moved through the woods. When he finally reached the highway, he flagged down a police officer, the one who reported his apparent drunkenness. Eventually, Mihalak made it back to the hotel parking lot on his own steam, the place where we begin this story. This whole thing does not sound likely, but according to archived Royal Canadian Mounted Police documents, this case went from a too many wobbly pops to a full-blown UFO hunt by the police, Army, and Air Force. Locals all remember the military helicopters overhead that spring. An Air Force chopper with a crew of 7 soldiers and 2 RCMP officers landed on the golf course one evening. They had just spent the day making passes over those woods. The next day, a Canadian Army helicopter joined the search. They combed the area with teams on the ground and in the air. They found some landmarks that Mihalak had described, but nothing more. His instructions were too vague. According to Mihalak's physician, he had been too sick to participate in the initial days of the search. He hadn't been able to eat solid foods since the incident and had dropped 13 pounds. But 2 RCMP officers drove back to Winnipeg that night and knocked on his door. The pair convinced Mihalak to come out to Falcon Lake with them the next morning. They took Mihalak up in an Army helicopter, but nothing looked familiar from above. He didn't do much better with the ground team, and so after dark, the RCMP drove Mihalak back to Winnipeg. After dropping him off at his house, the officers turned around and drove the 2 hours back to Falcon Lake to regroup with the military. In the evening of one of the search days, there was a gathering in the hotel lounge with some official-looking folks. The hotel owner was curious and asked where they were all from. One of the men said he was with NASA. The helicopters in the sky continued for a fourth day. By this time, there were 2 other foreign groups leading their own investigations. The head of the UFO project for the United States government was around, as well as members of the American group, ARPO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which at the time had a large staff of consulting PhD scientists. Locals weren't really sure what to make of it all. It was an outrageous sounding report. Some guy wandered into the woods and had been burned by the exhaust of a UFO. Could it really be extraterrestrials? Was it the Russians? Was this just an elaborate hoax? Maybe Mihalak was just a wacko who burned himself with a barbecue. Maybe. But it could not be denied that there were helicopters thumping in that air and that things were getting weird out at Falcon Lake. So that is the Falcon Lake Incident. Is this the story that you've heard before? This is probably Canada's most credible and most, I would say, famous UFO report. So, let me know what you think. Leave a comment. You think this is a legitimate UFO sighting? And what do you think of the pictures of those burn marks on Mihalak's stomach and chest area? They're very interesting, to say the least. So if you enjoyed this story, please hit that thumbs up. And if you're not already, if you would subscribe, I would appreciate that. And hit that bell so you can hear all the stories that we share with our friends here at Bigfoot Lake. So thanks for coming, and hope you have a great night. And we'll see you on the next.